So what's up with the Fed? The Federal Reserve. This is one of those kind of falls into the category of obscure questions that most people don't even wonder about, but it could have a huge impact on your life. The Fed responded to the 2020 crash, essentially, which was provoked by, obviously, COVID worldwide. The Fed responded to that by doing two things. Number one, they dropped interest rates down to zero. I mean, functionally, in some cases, arguably even negative interest rates. They were basically giving banks all the money they wanted. They didn't want to risk a repeat of what happened in 2008, during the Bush crash. And then secondly, what they did is they started buying bonds. People were not, bonds are long-term investments. They're debt instruments. And nobody was buying bonds. The bonds were paying so little interest that, they didn't have much value. But companies need to issue bonds. Many of these are corporate bonds, actually, as well as governmental bonds. Governments and corporations need to issue bonds in order to get operating money. And if the bond market collapses, that could be as bad as a stock market collapse. In fact, arguably, it could be worse. It's hard to measure which would be worse, but they're both bad events, right? It's like heart attack or cancer, right? So they had bought up $4.5 trillion worth of Treasury bonds, and also, large quantities of other kinds of bonds. They'd bought trillions of dollars in corporate bonds as well. This was between February 2020 and April of 2022 when they stopped buying bonds. And since April of 2022, they have shrunk that portfolio by $1.3 trillion. In part, some of those bonds simply matured. Others, they just sold them back into the marketplace, And the question now, as Matthew Klein writes over at theovershoot.co, is what happens next? Because the Fed really doesn't want to be using buying and selling bonds as a way to control inflation. They'd rather do that by controlling short-term interest rates, which then echo through the economy as home mortgage rates and car loan rates and credit card rates and everything else. So Lori Logan, not the right-wing crazy, but the former president, actually the current president of the Federal Reserve Bank of Dallas, who used to be at the New York Fed and was in charge of market operations at the New York Fed, which would include buying and selling bonds, says that the Fed wants to slow down or halt this this balance sheet shrinkage. In other words, they're at the point now, according to her, where they're saying, sitting on $3.5 trillion roughly dollars worth of bonds is a good thing. we're good right now. And yet, nobody's really sure exactly what they're going to do. They bought about $2 trillion worth of bonds between April and May of 2020, and then added another $2.5 trillion between May and April of 2022. And now, and the other thing is that, holding bonds, buying bonds and holding bonds is technically a form of economic stimulus. So the Fed is in this situation where if they start getting rid of these bonds, if they start selling these bonds, shedding these bonds, they run the risk of producing deflation, of reducing inflation, of collapsing the economy. On the other hand, if they hang on to them, they're arguably artificially stimulating the economy. And so they're just, they don't want to deprive the banking system of liquidity, which is one of the things that is available as a result of their holding bonds. So right now, nobody really knows where the Fed is going to go with this. And there's a big debate within the Fed. So I just wanted to put that on your radar screen. For most people, oh, bonds and Fed, it's like, what the hell is that? It's going to have to do with inflation. It's going to have to do with interest rates. It's going to have, but most importantly, it's going to have to do with whether the economy is robust and growing or not. And so pay attention to this. This is something worth keeping an eye on. It's one of those kind of leading indicators. When the Fed takes actions around their bond holdings, you see the impact of that typically months later sometimes even years later in the real marketplace. So something worth, kind of knowing what's going on.